You know, Carl, these people who pass through here, they all tell pretty good stories. A surveyor making a map. A botanist cataloging plants. An old man taking his house to Paradise Falls. That's the best one yet. I can't wait to hear how it ends. Up.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses.
The movie that we're going to analyze today, that we're going to break down, is Pixar's Up. It's a story that I personally fell in love with when I first watched it when it came out. I cried in the theaters watching it. It's so good. And it's largely because of the characters. So as a reminder, we are going to be looking it up and breaking down the characters, the plot structure, the world building, and the overall storytelling technique.
And that begins with those characters. The first thing that struck me in my watching and analysis this time around was their names. The way that they use names in this story was very interesting to me, because when talking about Carl or Mr. Fredricksen, it was often the villain using a more familiar first name, and it was the friends using the less familiar Mr. Last Name.
Yeah, you think about all the times that Russell, the kid, in his overeager, overexcited way, always says, Mr. Fredricksen. But you have Charles Muntz, the villain of the story, trying to use Carl, being buddy-buddy and trying to be very familiar with him, always using that first name. It creates this very interesting dynamic that we don't often associate in modern days with that kind of addressing of each other.
I also thought it was interesting that the main hero and the main villain have such similar first names. There's Carl and Charles. Normally in storytelling, when you have the main hero and the main villain reflecting each other, it's often they're presented with the same choices but deciding differently. In this case, the two characters are very separate. The only real thing they have in similarity is their generation, that they're both kind of in a similar age group, and their names. Everything else is very separate. So I thought it was an interesting choice to make their first names so similar.
And I think the biggest main character is somebody that is often overlooked, and that is Ellie. She starts the story as a main character, as a person. Her character then really transforms and becomes the house itself, because that's where Carl sees her.
I am always fascinated by characters who have such a heavy influence in the story, but have no dialogue whatsoever. The One Ring is another example of this, or The Force. They influence the scene even though they can't physically interact with anything on their own, and they don't have any lines of dialogue. So Ellie is a really good reflection of that within the house. As far as the plot arcs of the characters, Carl's the only one with a really strong plot arc. Russell has a little bit of one that's introduced in his backstory with the lack of a father figure, and he kind of gloms on to Carl. There isn't a whole lot of personal change beyond finding this mentor character. Doug is just a good boy all the time. Ellie's a house, doesn't care.
And then, of course, notably, Charles Muntz does not have an arc because he doesn't actually progress anywhere. He gets stuck in that same pattern of not seeing what's really important, of not seeing the good that he could be doing if he were to stop being selfish about it. Now, one of the notable things for the characters in Up, and I think something that Pixar is very well known for, is the character choice, the dialogue choice for each character.
One of the things that I think they did really well in this movie is the varying amount of complexity for the dialogue that each of the characters had and what that tells us about the character. So the most obvious reflection of this is Doug. He's mostly monosyllabic, his grammar and his syntax is not always on point, but he is very sincere, and that is our favorite thing about him.
And then on the flip side of that, we have Muntz, who uses very complex, very sophisticated words because so much of his personality is trying to show that he is better, trying to show that he is the best, and that no one can outwit him, that no one can be superior to him in his intellect and his capabilities. Let's get into the plot structure. This is really where Up shines. This is where Pixar in general shines, is they have a very specific plot style that they use.
As far as I know, we just call it the Pixar plot structure, and that works. That is the very straightforward once upon a time, blank, every day, blank, until one day, blank. Our inciting action is not till our third plot point there. Because of that, such and such happens. Because of that, even more stuff happens. Until finally, and ever since then, the end.
Up very clearly follows this exact pattern. Once upon a time, there was a boy who met a girl, and they spent time together every day. They got married, they had a life, they were wonderfully happy, until one day
he attached a bunch of balloons to the house and floated off to South America. Because of that, he accidentally kidnapped a kid, until finally he decides that moving the house is not as important as living in the moment, and ever since then, they eat ice cream on the curb. A key indicator of this type of structure is how long it takes to get to the inciting action.
In Up, it takes us 21 minutes and 11 seconds before we get to that very key action of the balloons being released. This is the moment that's kind of that point of no return for Carl.
And then at the very end, it is a very quick wrap-up. 4 minutes before credits roll, Muntz falls from the dirigible. So you've got a slow build into it and a very fast finale. And that is very indicative of this particular type of plot structure.
Because we don't need to spend a lot of time in that and ever since then part of the Pixar plot. We just need to show a brief moment that represents how life is after the until finally.
It's easy to think that because this movie takes place on Earth, that there isn't world building, but there actually is some pretty significant stuff. Yes, South America exists and we don't need to be taught this, but we do need to be taught who Charles Muntz is and what Paradise Falls is.
And in the story, they do this in such a beautiful way at the very beginning because you see child Carl looking up to his hero, Muntz. You see him watching the film reels of Muntz going on his adventures, and then Muntz being called a fraud and disappearing. So we get all of this really relevant information, but we see it through the eyes of young Carl.
A lot of the rest of the information that is given about backstory and the worlds prior to this particular story is Carl talking to Ellie. Sometimes Ellie talking to Carl if we're talking that first 10 minutes or so. But as far as learning about Muntz and Paradise Falls, that is mostly between the hero and his true love.
With all of the characters, with all of the plot, it is such a beautifully written story. And of course, there are a couple of things that they had to use that may have thrown people off that suspension of disbelief, but they incorporated it so well that it didn't matter. Because really, there were three main impossible things. Of course, you had the house being lifted by a bunch of helium balloons. That's not really plausible, and to keep especially the house together. And then you have this bird, Kevin, that does not exist, and that is kind of an impossible thing. And then you, of course, have the talking dogs. And I think it's largely because they did a really good job of setting it up. In the intro montage with Ellie, you see him struggling at times to keep his balloon cart on the ground because the balloons keep trying to lift it up. So they establish a precedence for balloons being extra powerful in this world so that it is way more believable when we see him unleash a huge bunch of balloons and it lifts up the entire house.
The other interesting thing about the overall storytelling technique is that Carl's goal had basically nothing to do with conquering the villain. The villain was in the way a couple of times, but we don't even have the two characters intersect until like halfway through the movie. Because Carl's goal is over there. The inciting incident has nothing to do with the villain at all.
And really, the only connection that he had with Muntz in the first place is that Muntz is the one who discovered Paradise Falls, and Carl's and Ellie's love of the adventures that Muntz went on is kind of what brought them together in the first place. So hopefully this has helped you look at that Pixar structure, be able to then take any elements from this story, and it was the first introduction into really looking and analyzing a story that you may be familiar with. Next up, our homework for you is going to be watching The Princess Bride. It is a classic and one of my all-time favorite movies, if not my all-time favorite movie. It is a ride, to say the least.
This one is interesting because it's a movie based off of a book. So there is an extra layer to that. We'll talk about that next episode. And until then,
Write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.